Elise, you mailed this to me.
I don't know where you got that. Security!
Billionaire went homeless to test true love. Wealthy woman publicly rejected the Beggar Part 1. The public wrong, sir, you can't stand near the entrance. Jonah Price had been inside the glass atrium of the Langley Arts Center for less than 30 seconds when a security guard stepped between him and the champagne tables. Jonah stopped where he was. At 41, he was a tall black man with dark brown skin, of beard along his jaw, and rein still clinging to the shoulders of an old canvas coat. The coat had come from a church donation rack 3 days earlier. His invitation had not, either. "I'm here for the Harrow Foundation dinner," he said, holding out the cream card. The guard looked at the frayed cuffs before he looked at the embossed name. Around them, guests moved beneath suspended sculptures in black jackets and evening gowns, their voices blending with the soft scrape of a string quartet. Jonah had spent enough time in rooms like this to recognize the choreography. Someone noticed something that did not fit. Someone else decided it needed moving. And only afterward did anybody bother checking whether it belonged. Guard finally read the card. "Jonah Price, that's me." A woman behind the registration table glanced toward her tablet. Her name tag read Tessa. Before she could search the list, a familiar voice came from behind Jonah. "What is going on?" Elise Harrow crossed the marble floor with a half-full champagne flute in one hand. She wore a silver gown Jonah had seen hanging in her apartment 2 weeks earlier. When she had asked him whether he thought the neckline was too severe, he had told her no. She had laughed and said he was terrible at giving useful fashion advice. Now she looked directly at him and did not smile. Jonah had expected surprise, maybe anger. He had even prepared himself for embarrassment after the lie he had told her 3 days earlier, that his consulting work had collapsed, his savings were gone, and he no longer had a place to live. What he had not prepared for was how quickly recognition disappeared from her face once she noticed the coat. "Elise," he said. Her eyes moved to the people nearest them. 2 donors had already stopped talking. The guard turned slightly. "Mrs. Harrow, he says he's attending your dinner." "He isn't." Jonah felt the answer more sharply than he wanted to. He had known this experiment was ugly when he began it. His older sister had called it manipulative. Jonah had called it necessary, which was the kind of word a man used when he wanted to make a bad idea sound disciplined. He held out the invitation to me. Elise did not touch it. "I don't know where you got that." Tessa looked up from her tablet. "There is a Jonah Price on table 12. For a moment, nobody spoke. Jonah watched Elise hear the same thing he did, an exit. She could have laughed awkwardly, taken his arm, asked him privately what had happened. She could have admitted she knew him and still been furious about his appearance. Any of those choices would have hurt less than what came next. "That Jonah Price is a guest of mine," Elise said. "This man is not." The guard's posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough. His hand moved closer to the radio clipped at his chest. Jonah looked at Elise. "My last name again." Her mouth tightened. "Please don't make a scene. I'm standing still." A few feet away, a waiter set down a tray too quickly. Glass touched glass with a bright, nervous click. Elise glanced toward the sound and then toward Malcolm Dyer, the Foundation's board treasurer, who had started walking in their direction. Jonah understood then that she was not afraid of him. She was afraid of being seen knowing him. Tessa turned her tablet so the guard could see it. "The record says the invitation was confirmed yesterday. Same name." "Anyone could use a name," Elise said. "Look at him." The words were soft. That made them worse. Jonah had spent the previous 2 nights at New Hope Shelter by choice, sleeping in a narrow bunk beneath a humming ventilation duct while his penthouse sat empty 6 miles away. He had eaten cafeteria eggs, waited for a shower, and listened to men describe jobs they had lost without having another life waiting for them in reserve. By the second morning, he had already begun to hate himself a little for treating their reality as something he could step into and out of. But Elise did not know he could step out. It had been the point. The guard handed the invitation back without checking Jonah's identification. "Sir, I need you to leave. Your registration list confirms me. Mrs. Harrow says you're not her guest." Jonah looked past him at Elise. She lowered her voice. "Where you thought we were, Jonah? This isn't the place." There it was. Not confusion. Not policy. Rejection. Malcolm Dyer reached them and asked what the problem was. Elise answered before anyone else could. He's been bothering me, and now he's trying to get into the event. Jonah saw Tessa's head lift. That isn't what happened, she said. Elise stared at her. The guard touched his radio. Really? Do you want him removed from the property? Jonah waited. Elise had one final chance to choose differently. Yes, she said. And make sure he can't come back tonight. The guard radioed the desk and gave Jonah's name for the incident log. Jonah folded the invitation once, slid it into the inside pocket of his donated coat, and walked toward the doors without resisting. Behind him, Tessa was still staring at the registration screen. She had seen the invitation. More importantly, she had heard Elise recognize his name before pretending she didn't. Part 2. The wrong story Gans authority Jonah had reached the curb when the security supervisor caught up with him beneath the Arts Center awning. Rain tapped against the metal canopy and gathered along the seams of Jonah's coat. The supervisor introduced himself as Aaron Wells and asked Jonah to wait while they clarified the situation. Jonah almost laughed at the phrase. 5 minutes earlier, nobody had wanted clarification. Now that his name had entered an incident log, the building had discovered a vocabulary for procedure. Aaron was a broad-shouldered black man in his 50s with reading glasses clipped inside his jacket. He did not treat Jonah warmly, but he did something the first guard had not. "You have identification?" he asked. Jonah handed over his driver's license. Aaron compared the photograph, the name, and the invitation before speaking into his radio. "Confirm whether Table 12 has Jonah Price registered, and tell me who entered the record." The reply came through static. The name was there, guest status confirmed, invitation issued through the Harrow Foundation office. Jonah slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "Then I'd like to go back inside." Aaron hesitated. "There's another issue now." Of course there was. The account traveling through the building had already changed. According to the first guard's radio report, Jonah had presented a questionable invitation. By the time Aaron received the message, Jonah had allegedly refused instructions and made a female donor uncomfortable. Elise's name had disappeared from the description. So had Tessa's statement that the registration matched. What remained was a man in worn clothes, an upset woman, and a security response that suddenly looked reasonable when stripped of sequence. "I didn't refuse anything," Jonah said. "Ask your guard what instruction I refused." Aaron removed his glasses and wiped rain mist from one lens. "I'm not saying you did. You're repeating a report that says I did. That's why I'm checking it." It was the first answer Jonah had received all evening that sounded like an actual process, and his irritation made him almost miss it. His sister's criticism surfaced inconveniently in his mind. "You keep saying you want the truth, but you've built a situation where everyone is being tested without agreeing to the test." He pushed the thought aside. Elise had still made her own choices. That part was real. Inside the lobby, Tessa had stopped checking in guests. Malcolm Dyer stood beside her registration table while Elise spoke to the foundation's event director, Nora Feld. Jonah could see them through the glass. Nora listened with the expression of someone calculating damage in real time. When Aaron brought Jonah back through the outer doors but stopped him before the velvet entry line, Nora walked over immediately. "Mr. Price, I understand there was an interaction with one of our patrons." "One of your patrons invited me." Nora gave a professional half-smile. "What I've been told is that you approached Ms. Harrow in a way she found distressing." "I said her name. She says there is personal history." "There is, and that tonight is not an appropriate venue to resolve it." Jonah looked at Elise across the atrium. She had found a cleaner story now. Not a stranger trying to sneak inside, but an unwanted man from her past who had followed her into a formal event. It was better because pieces of it were technically true. They had a personal history. He had come knowing she would be here. Truth, Jonah thought, could be damaged without anyone inventing very much. "Check the invitation record," he said. "Requested it, when it was issued, and where the confirmation came from." Nora's expression tightened. "Your name being on a list doesn't give you permission to harass another attendee, and her discomfort doesn't erase how I got on the list." At the table, Tessa lowered her eyes toward the tablet. She remembered something Jonah had not known. 2 days earlier, Elise herself had called registration because Jonah had not responded to the first confirmation email. Tessa had entered a note after the call. "Host reconfirmed guest personally." "Do not release seat." Nora asked Tessa to pull up the guest record. For several seconds, Tessa did nothing. Malcolm leaned toward her. Just print the current entry. Current. Baird made her look at him. The screen in front of her showed the guest record had been edited less than 4 minutes earlier. The original host note was no longer visible in the main field. Someone with administrative access had changed Jonah's status from confirmed to review and added, guest identity disputed by host. Possible unauthorized transfer. Tessa's stomach tightened. She did not know who had made the change, but she knew what had been there before. What does it say? Nora asked. Tessa reached beneath the table for the small notebook she used when the wireless check-in system lagged. Instead of answering, she wrote down the edit time and the user initials displayed in the audit corner of the screen. Then she looked at Jonah. The record changed, she said. Malcolm's face hardened. Tessa. She turned the tablet toward Nora before anyone could stop her, and for the first time that evening the problem was no longer Jonah's coat. Part 3. The irreversible line. Nora leaned over the registration table. The audit corner showed the change clearly enough. Jonah's status had been altered at 8:17 p.m., 4 minutes after security first called from the entrance. The initials beside the edit were MD. Malcolm Dyer did not look at the screen. He looked at Tessa. That field gets corrected all night, he said. People transfer invitations, hosts change guests. Tessa kept one hand beside the tablet instead of giving it to him. The host note was there before. What host note? Nora asked. Tessa swallowed. Ms. Harrow called 2 days ago. She asked us not to release Mr. Price's seat if he arrived late. I entered it myself. Elise stepped closer. I may have said Jonah was coming before things changed between us. That was the first time she had admitted publicly that she knew him. Jonah watched Nora register the contradiction, then smooth her expression before anyone else could. He had spent years in acquisition rooms where one line in a financial model could decide whether people asked another question or decided they had already heard enough. This felt disturbingly similar. The facts were present. What mattered now was whether the institution treated them as inconvenient or controlling. I want the original entry preserved, Jonah said, including the edit history. Malcolm gave him a thin smile. You don't get to dictate our data procedures. No, but I can ask you not to destroy a record connected to a dispute. You're turning a misunderstanding into a threat. I didn't mention a lawsuit. The first guard shifted beside Aaron. Jonah noticed it because Aaron did. The supervisor asked him, when you approached Mr. Price, had you checked his invitation yet? The guard took a second too long. I was responding to a concern about access. That wasn't my question. He was dressed in a way that raised a concern. Aaron's gaze hardened. For a ticketed charity event? The guard corrected himself. He said Jonah had been lingering near the entrance, although Jonah had barely crossed the atrium before being stopped. Then he said Elise had appeared distressed. Tessa looked from him to Jonah and shook her head once, almost unconsciously. Nora exhaled. All right. This evening is becoming disruptive. Mr. Price, regardless of how the registration issue happened, Ms. Harrow has withdrawn her invitation. The Foundation reserves the right to refuse entry when there is concern for another guest's comfort. Jonah felt something in him drop, not because he had expected Elise to rescue him, but because the organization had finally converted her embarrassment into policy. Does that rule apply after a guest has been admitted to the list? It applies when circumstances change. Then put that in writing. Nora blinked. Excuse me? The reason you're denying entry. Put it in the incident report exactly as you just said it. Elise lowered her glass. Jonah, stop. He looked at her. You asked them to remove me. You're removing me. This is what you do, she said, frustration breaking through the polished tone. You make everything into a test. The words struck closer than anything else that evening. Jonah knew she did not understand how literally correct she was, and that made his stomach turn. For one reckless second he wanted to end it. He could tell her who still signed the quarterly reports for Price Meridian Holdings. He could take the family office that had quietly funded 3 of the Foundation's neighborhood grants through an intermediary. He could make half the room reconsider his coat before the next glass of champagne reached a tray. He said none of it, because if respect arrived only after the money did, the answer would be useless. Nora instructed Aaron to escort Jonah beyond the property line. Aaron did not move immediately. I'll do that, he said. After the report reflects that his identification matched the invitation and that the registration status was changed after contact began. Malcolm's voice sharpened. That is an internal matter. It's part of the incident. Tessa finally made her choice. She opened the system's activity panel and used the event software's standard export function to send the guest history report to the Foundation's compliance archive, the same repository used for charge disputes and donor access complaints. The system generated a time-stamped confirmation number. She copied the number into her notebook. Malcolm saw what she had done. Who authorized that? It's the retention procedure for disputed check-ins. You should have asked me. You're the initials on the edit. The sentence left nowhere comfortable to stand. Jonah was escorted outside at 8:26. His access badge for the evening was marked void. His name remained under review. In the incident report now stated that entry had been denied after the host withdrew recognition of a previously confirmed guest. Pain had strengthened, bouncing off the curb in silver beads. Before Jonah walked away, Aaron gave him the incident number. Jonah entered it into his phone and submitted one request through the Arts Center's Public Guest Relations portal. Preserve the original registration record, all edits, and the incident report pending formal review. For the first time since beginning his experiment, he was no longer testing Elise. He was creating a record of what everyone had chosen to do. Part 4. Counterforce and personnel cost. Jonah did not return to the penthouse that night. He walked 4 blocks in the rain, bought coffee from a 24-hour diner, and then took the bus back toward New Hope Shelter with his hood pulled low. The choice had stopped feeling principled. It felt childish now, a rich man insisting on remaining inside an experiment after the experiment had already hurt real people. At the shelter entrance, he stood beneath a flickering exterior light and stared at his phone until the screen dimmed around the incident number. His sister, Mara, called before he made it upstairs. Jonah considered ignoring her, which meant she called again. "Tell me you ended this," she said when he answered. Jonah sat on a plastic chair near the vending machines while 2 men argued quietly over a charger across the room. Not yet. Mara was silent long enough that he could hear traffic through her car speakers. Then this is not about learning who Elise is anymore. You learned that. Jonah rubbed rainwater from the edge of his sleeve. Something happened with the guest record, and now you're going to make that your excuse to keep going. He disliked the accuracy of it. Jonah explained the edit, Tessa's note, and Aaron's insistence that the identification check be included in the incident report. Mara listened, then asked the question he had been avoiding. "Did Elise know you were testing her?" "No." "Did anybody in that building?" "No," Mara sighed. "Then don't confuse what she did with what you did. She humiliated you. That matters. You also lied to someone you claimed to care about, because you wanted a clean answer to a messy question." Jonah nearly snapped back. Instead, he said, "I know." It came out sharper than he intended. He ended the call 2 minutes later without resolving anything, then regretted it before the phone left his hand. Across the room, a shelter volunteer was showing an older man how to use a job application site on a cracked laptop. Jonah watched him struggle to remember a password. The ordinary difficulty of it embarrassed Jonah more than Mara had. He could stop being homeless whenever he wanted. Everyone around him had to negotiate with systems that did not care whether they were tired. The next morning, Tessa arrived at the Arts Center 20 minutes before her shift and discovered her login no longer opened the registration platform. A yellow message instructed her to report to administration. Malcolm was already there with Nora. He said the account suspension was temporary because she had exported donor information outside authorized workflow. Tessa corrected him. She had sent a system-generated audit report to the Foundation's compliance archive, not to herself. Malcolm replied that intention was beside the point. Nora looked uncomfortable but did not challenge him. "We just need to establish what happened. Then restore my access and check the log," Tessa said. Malcolm folded his hands. "You're not part of the review anymore." That frightened her more than being accused. She had worked enough fundraising events to recognize the difference between an investigation and containment. Before surrendering her temporary badge, she wrote the compliance confirmation number from her notebook onto the back of a grocery receipt and folded it into her wallet. The number did not prove Jonah had been treated unfairly. It proved only that a preserved version of the guest record should exist somewhere Malcolm could not casually overwrite. At Price Meridian Holdings, Jonah's absence had begun creating its own cost. His chief operating officer, Denise Carver, had covered 2 investor calls under the explanation that Jonah was taking personal leave. The third could not be moved. She sent him a message asking whether she should invoke the succession protocol for a scheduled acquisition review. Bill stared at the words from a shelter cafeteria table while someone beside him peeled the foil from a yogurt cup. He called Denise from outside. She had known Jonah for 11 years and did not waste time pretending approval. "You said you needed 3 days," she told him. "This is day 4. I know." "No, you know the number." "I'm asking whether you understand what you're risking." Jonah told her about the art center. Denise listened, then said, "Preserve the complaint. Let independent counsel review it. Come back to work. I want to know how far they'll take it. That is exactly the problem. You keep moving the finish line because you're angry." Jonah paced beside the shelter loading dock, where wet cardboard sagged inside a recycling cage. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. Instead, he authorized Denise to chair the acquisition review without him, a concession that cost him more pride than control. By noon, the art center's automated response arrived. Jonah's preservation request had been accepted. A second message followed 9 minutes later. The foundation was not merely reviewing the incident. Its compliance office had flagged 3 prior guest access complaints from the same annual event series, each involving records changed after a dispute at entry. Jonah read the sentence twice. Whatever had happened to him had started with Elise. It might not have started with him. Part 5. The reversal or deeper problem. Jonah read the compliance notice beneath the shelter's concrete stairwell, where the signal was strongest and the smell of industrial detergent drifted up from the laundry room. 3 earlier complaints did not prove a pattern. He knew that much. They could involve different guards, different circumstances, even legitimate removals. What mattered was that someone had changed access records after each dispute. The same mechanism that had nearly rewritten his night had been used before. He forwarded the notice to Denise and called her before he could talk himself out of it. "I'm coming back in," he said. "Not to take over the acquisition meeting. I need our outside counsel to look at one thing." Denise made him explain exactly what he wanted before agreeing. Jonah asked for no threats, no donor pressure, and no disclosure of his connection to Price Meridian, unless verification required it. "Independent review only," he said. Denise paused. "Good. Because the minute you use the company to punish a woman for rejecting you, I'm walking into your office and saying that in front of everybody." By 10:30, Jonah was showered and wearing clean clothes from the shelter donation room rather than anything from his own closet. He kept the canvas coat. The decision was partly stubbornness and partly shame. He wanted to remember what the room had looked like when no one knew what he owned. At the Arts Center, meanwhile, Compliance Director Felicia Grant had begun comparing the 4 disputed guest files. She was not employed by Malcolm's event team and reported to the center's audit committee, which meant he could not simply close her review. The first complaint involved a black physician whose donor credential had been marked unverified after she challenged a bag search that other guests were not receiving. The second came from a Latino contractor invited by a board member and later described as aggressive after asking why his identification had been checked twice. The third involved an older black couple whose table assignment had disappeared after a staff member decided their printed invitation looked copied. Each file differed. None proved discrimination by itself. But Felicia found the same operational feature in all 3. An event administrator had edited the primary guest entry after security contact, making the later record align more closely with the decision already made at the door. Malcolm had administrative access for every event. That fact was not enough to accuse him of personally making each edit. 2 coordinators shared the same permission level during gala nights. Felicia therefore requested the server audit rather than relying on the visible initials. The back-end log recorded terminal identifiers, timestamps, and user authentication. It also preserved an earlier version of Jonah's file despite the edit Malcolm had made at the registration table. At 1:14 p.m., Felicia called Tessa back into the building. Tessa expected another disciplinary conversation. Instead, Felicia placed a printed activity report between them and asked her to describe exactly what she had entered when Elise called. Tessa did not embellish. She said, "Mr. Price might arrive late. She told me not to release his seat. I typed, 'Host, reconfirmed guest personally.' Not release seat. Felicia pointed to the archived version. The sentence was there, time-stamped 2 days before the gala. And who told you to print the current entry last night? Mr. Dyer. Before or after he changed it? Tessa looked at the log. After. That afternoon, Malcolm received a formal preservation notice and temporary removal of his registration system privileges pending audit committee review. He was not suspended from the foundation, and he had not been found responsible for the earlier complaints. The distinction mattered, but for the first time, he could no longer alter the records being used to examine his own conduct. Elise learned about the hold from Nora and immediately called Jonah. He was sitting across from Denise in a small conference room at Price Meridian, his donated coat folded over the back of a chair. Denise had just finished mocking his shelter coffee when his phone lit with Elise's name. Jonah almost let it ring out. "You filed some kind of investigation?" Elise asked when he answered. "I filed a preservation request. They're freezing Malcolm's access because of you, because of the audit log. You have no idea what this could do to the foundation." Jonah glanced at Denise. She did not intervene. "Did you call registration 2 days before the dinner and confirm my seat?" Silence, then. Yes, the admission hurt more in private than the lie had in public. Jonah asked one more question. "Why did you say you didn't know where I got the invitation?" Elise's voice dropped. "Because when I saw you dressed like that in front of those people, I panicked. Not because she thought he was dangerous. No, not because she doubted his identity, because she had believed he was poor." Before Jonah could answer, Denise slid a document across the table. Price Meridian's counsel had completed the conflict check. One of the Arts Center's neighborhood programs received funding through a charitable trust whose controlling benefactor was Jonah himself. His identity would now have to be disclosed to the audit committee before any further review involving that funding relationship. The disguise had reached its limit. Part 6, the second problem in motion. The disclosure meeting took place without champagne, cameras, or anyone dressed for a gala. Jonah sat in a windowless conference room at the Langley Arts Center with Denise beside him and the donated canvas coat folded across his knees. Across the table were Felicia Grant, 2 members of the audit committee, and outside counsel retained by the center. Jonah had expected the revelation of his wealth to change the temperature. It did. What surprised him was how little he liked it. Felicia read the conflict memorandum first. Jonah was the controlling benefactor of the Alder Street Trust, which had committed $4.8 million over 3 years to the center's neighborhood arts program. The foundation staff did not ordinarily know the names behind every donor-advised vehicle. But the audit committee had to know now because its investigation could affect an organization receiving Jonah's money. A committee member looked from the memorandum to Jonah's coat and then back again. "You could have identified yourself Friday night," he said. "I could have. Why didn't you?" Jonah glanced at Denise before answering. "At first, because I was doing something personal that I'm not especially proud of. After they denied entry because I wanted the complaint handled as if my money didn't exist." The committee member frowned. "But your money does exist. That's why I'm disclosing it now." Outside counsel proposed separating Jonah's guest complaint from the review of earlier incidents. Denise objected immediately. "The same access system connected them," she said, but Jonah interrupted her. "Separate my funding authority from the evidence. If the earlier files don't stand without me, they shouldn't stand." Denise turned toward him. "That sounds cleaner than it is. You're still the complainant whose case triggered preservation." "I know. And you still seem determined to prove you're not using leverage by refusing to use leverage even where normal governance requires disclosure." Jonah felt irritation rise before he recognized she was right about at least half of it. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to stop performing poverty and start acting like the person responsible for the commitments you actually made." Nobody at the table rescued him from the sentence. Across the building, Felicia's technical reviewer had begun testing Malcolm's explanation for the altered records. Malcolm maintained that guest entries were routinely updated after disputes because event staff needed the system to reflect current access status. That was plausible. A registration database could not remain frozen while circumstances changed. The question was whether the original information had been preserved and whether edits accurately described why access changed. Jonah's file failed that test. The reviewer compared the archived guest history with the visible record Malcolm had created. The new entry stated that Jonah's identity was disputed by the host and suggested a possible unauthorized transfer. Neither claim matched what Elise later admitted. She had known Jonah, had personally confirmed his seat, and had withdrawn recognition only after seeing him arrive, dressed as a man she believed had become homeless. Still, the altered record proved only what happened to Jonah. The earlier complaints were harder. In one, the black physician had been listed as credential unconfirmed, but no surviving note showed whether her invitation had been verified before the dispute. The contractor's file contained conflicting timestamps. The older couple's complaint was almost 2 years old, and one paper sign-in sheet had been destroyed under the center's normal retention schedule. Felicia refused to call the cases a pattern simply because they looked similar. That afternoon, Aaron Wells supplied the missing angle. Security used a separate dispatch platform from guest registration. Event staff could change invitation records, but they could not rewrite the time-stamped dispatch created when guards called for supervisory assistance. Aaron requested the archived logs for all 4 incidents. The audit committee authorized retrieval. Elise called Jonah again while he was leaving the center. This time he answered outside near the loading entrance where stagehands were rolling lighting cases into a truck. "I told them what happened," she said. "All of it? I told Felicia I knew who you were." Jonah waited. Elise continued. "I also told her you had said you lost everything. I thought you had. You thought I was broke. Yes, and that made you ashamed to know me." Her breath caught. "I don't know how to make that sound better." "Don't." For once, neither of them tried to win the silence. When Jonah returned inside, Felicia was waiting near the security office with 4 printed dispatch summaries. The same phrase appeared in 3 of them before any guest record had been changed. Credential confirmed at desk. In Jonah's report, it appeared at 8:14, 3 minutes before Malcolm edited his status to suggest his identity might be false. Felicia placed the reports into a sealed audit folder. "Tomorrow," she said, "we compare these against the server authentication logs. If the timestamps aligned, the review would no longer be about messy recollections at crowded events. It would show whether official records had repeatedly been rewritten after staff already knew the guest belonged there." Part 7. The collision and accountability test. Felicia began the audit review with the dispatch logs already spread across the conference table. No one gave an opening statement. A technical reviewer connected a laptop to the wall display, entered the archive credentials, and pulled up the registration server's authentication history. Jonah sat beside Denise with his hands around a paper cup of coffee he had not touched. Across from them, Malcolm Dyer had brought counsel. Elise sat 2 seats away from him, looking as if she had slept badly. The reviewer started with Jonah's file because its sequence was complete. At 8:14 p.m., a security dispatch recorded that the guest credential had been confirmed at the registration desk. At 8:16, Aaron requested supervisory clarification because the host disputed the guest presence. At 8:17, Malcolm's authenticated account changed Jonah's registration from confirmed to review and added the note suggesting an unauthorized transfer. No transfer request existed. No identity mismatch existed. Jonah's driver's license had already matched the invitation. Malcolm's lawyer leaned forward. The notation reflected uncertainty created by the host's objection. Felicia looked at the screen. Then why does it say identity disputed? Because the host disputed whether he was the intended guest. Elise spoke before Malcolm could stop her. "I didn't." Everyone turned. She kept her eyes on the table. "I knew Jonah was the person I invited. I didn't think someone else had his invitation. I wanted him removed because I was embarrassed by how he looked, and I said things that gave staff a different impression." Malcolm stared at her. "That is not how you presented it that night." "No," Elise said. "It isn't." The reviewer moved to the earlier cases. The physician's registration record had been changed 7 minutes after security noted her credential was valid. The contractor's visible entry had been revised after dispatch recorded confirmation from the hosting board member. The older couple's file was incomplete. The surviving security summary showed their printed invitation had been accepted before the desk, later marked their status as unresolved. In all 3 cases, Malcolm's account had authenticated at the same terminal used for the revisions. "That still doesn't establish discriminatory intent," his lawyer said. Jonah finally spoke. It doesn't have to prove what was in his head to prove what happened to the records. Denise glanced at him, a small warning against saying more than necessary. Ill. He listened. Felicia asked Malcolm why post-incident notes repeatedly made the original access decisions appear less questionable than the contemporaneous security logs did. Malcolm said gala nights were chaotic, staff needed one clean operational record, and he had corrected entries to reflect the final outcome. His explanation had surface logic. A live event system did need current information. But when Felicia asked why the original verified status had been overwritten instead of preserved with a separate removal note, Malcolm had no procedural answer. Because the system isn't designed like a courtroom transcript, he said. No, Felicia replied. It's designed with an audit history so corrections remain corrections. The distinction changed the room. Malcolm had not merely documented that guests were removed. He had altered the visible reason they appeared removable in the first place. Aaron then described the entrance procedure. If identification or invitation authenticity was genuinely uncertain, security was supposed to hold the guest at the desk until registration resolved it. The dispatch log showed confirmation before removal or restriction. That doesn't tell me why every staff member made every decision, he said. But it tells me we weren't dealing with unknown people by the time these incidents escalated. Felicia asked what Jonah wanted from the review. He had rehearsed several answers in the shelter, most of them too angry. Preserve the records. Review the prior complaints independently. Restore Tessa's access unless there's evidence she violated policy. Separate guest removal from the authority to rewrite registration history. And if the investigation finds misconduct, handle it through the center's normal process. One committee member asked, "You're not asking for Malcolm's termination?" "No. I'm asking you not to make accountability depend on what I'm worth." Elise looked at him then, and Jonah wished the sentence felt better than it did. The committee recessed for 40 minutes. When they returned, Felicia announced 3 immediate actions. Malcolm would remain locked out of registration systems and be placed on administrative leave pending the personnel review. Tessa's system access would be restored, and the audit committee would retain an external firm to examine the prior access complaints and event procedures. No final finding had been issued. Then Felicia added one thing nobody at the table had expected. The board had voted to pause acceptance of the next scheduled payment from the Alder Street Trust until the review was complete, avoiding any appearance that Jonah's funding could influence the outcome. The decision protected the investigation. It also froze $1.6 million intended for youth arts programming beginning the following month. Jonah looked at Denise. For the first time, the cost of keeping his money out of the process would fall on people who had nothing to do with what happened at the door. Part 8. The decision and its cost. The youth program director arrived at the Arts Center carrying a folder full of bus contracts. She had not attended the gala, did not know Jonah, and had no interest in the argument that had frozen $1.6 million. Her problem was simpler. 88 students were scheduled to begin Saturday workshops. In 3 weeks, instructors had signed agreements, and 2 neighborhood schools had already promised transportation. If the Alder Street payment remained paused beyond the month, she would have to cut the fall session before the investigation produced a single final finding. Jonah listened from the far end of the audit committee table and felt the trap he had helped build close around people who had never entered the atrium that night. "Can the center use reserves?" he asked. The finance chair said it could, but only through a board authorization, because the youth program had been budgeted against restricted grant revenue. Jonah started to offer a bridge payment through another Price Meridian vehicle, then stopped. Denise caught the unfinished sentence. "Don't," she said. "Different account, same benefactor." The board convened an emergency vote that afternoon. Jonah disclosed that he would neither accelerate the trust payment nor condition future funding on any personnel decision. He also waived his right, under the grant agreement, to object if the center temporarily replaced his restricted funds with unrestricted reserves. That did not give the board money. It removed one contractual obstacle to using money the center already had. After a tense discussion over liquidity, the directors approved a 90-day internal bridge so the workshops could proceed while the review remained independent. The decision cost the center elsewhere. A planned renovation of 2 rehearsal rooms would be postponed until winter, and the finance chair warned that another unexpected expense could force deeper cuts. Jonah did not pretend this was painless. His insistence on clean separation had protected the investigation, but his original deception had helped create the conflict that made separation necessary. Outside the meeting, Denise handed him the revised cash flow sheet. "That," she said, tapping the delayed renovation line, "is what consequences look like when they refuse to stay inside the story you intended." The personnel decision came later that evening. Malcolm remained on paid administrative leave while the external review continued. His authority over gala operations, guest registration, and staff evaluations was suspended immediately. The board did not terminate him because the investigation had not yet established the full scope of misconduct or whether other administrators shared responsibility. Nora retained her position. She was removed from supervising Tessa until reviewers determined why she had allowed Malcolm to characterize the preservation export as a possible policy violation. Tessa returned to the registration office the next morning. Her login worked again. Felicia met her there with Aaron and a systems administrator, not to congratulate her but to test the first operational correction. A confirmed guest record could no longer be overwritten after security contact. Staff could change current access status, but the system now required a separate reason field, supervisor identification, and timestamp while leaving the original confirmation visible. Any removal after credential verification automatically generated a preservation copy for compliance review. Aaron ran a test entry under a fictional guest name. Tessa confirmed the invitation, he simulated a host objection, and the administrator marked the guest as removed. The screen retained both facts, Krekenod verif, and access Lotter withdrawn by host. No one could convert the first fact into uncertainty simply because the second became inconvenient. Jonah watched from the doorway in the same canvas coat. Elise arrived before the test ended. She had resigned as chair of the Foundation's gala committee that morning, though she remained a donor and faced no employment sanction because she was not an employee. Her resignation statement did not mention Jonah's wealth. It acknowledged that she had knowingly denied recognizing a guest she had personally invited and had allowed staff to believe his identity was questionable. When they stepped outside, she said, "I suppose you got your answer." Jonah shook his head. "I got an answer about you. I also got one about me." She studied him. "Was any part of what we had real?" "Yes, that almost makes it worse." He could not argue. Jonah finally told her the entire truth. The consulting collapse had been invented, the homelessness had been voluntary, and the man she believed had lost everything still controlled Price Meridian Holdings and assets worth more than she had ever known. Elise laughed once, without humor, then covered her mouth. "You tested whether I would love someone poor," she said, "and never gave me the chance to decide whether I could love someone who lies to me." She walked away before he found an answer. Behind him, through the glass entrance, Tessa ran the new access test again. This time, the original record stayed exactly where it belonged. Part 9. Repair under pressure. 3 weeks after the gala, the Langley Arts Center reopened the same glass atrium for its first major public event under the revised access procedure. The string quartet was gone. Folding tables for the youth program lined the marble instead, covered with paint cups, registration cards, and boxes of clay. Jonah arrived before the doors opened, not because anyone needed him there, but because 48 students had nearly lost the program while adults argued about responsibility. He wore jeans, a navy sweater, and the old canvas coat over both. Tessa stood at the registration desk training 2 temporary staff members. The board had restored her hours in full and removed the disciplinary notation created after Malcolm accused her of mishandling donor information. More importantly to her, Felicia had placed the correction in writing. Tessa had asked for that herself. She did not want a private reassurance sitting beside a formal accusation that future managers could still see. When Jonah stopped near the desk, she held up one finger until she finished explaining the new status fields. "Verified is a fact," she told the trainees. "Removed later is another fact. Don't make one erase the other." Aaron heard her and smiled from the security station. His own department had spent 2 weeks rewriting entrance instructions. Guards could still intervene when behavior created a genuine safety concern, but clothing, perceived economic status, or a host's embarrassment could not substitute for verification. B. When a confirmed guest was challenged, the supervisor now had to record what staff actually knew at the moment of escalation. Aaron admitted the change should have existed years earlier. "We got used to trusting whoever looked like they belonged to the room," he told Jonah, "and I was part of that. Maybe not at the first 30 seconds with you, but before you. I signed reports I should questioned." Jonah did not tell him that confession made everything fine. "What are you doing differently?" Aaron nodded toward a young guard shadowing him. "Making them show me the step they skipped before I approve a removal." That answer mattered more. The external review arrived that afternoon. It found no evidence that every disputed access decision at Langley had been racially motivated, and the report refused to make that claim. It did find that Malcolm had repeatedly altered visible registration entries after security disputes in ways that obscured earlier credential confirmations. In 2 of the 3 prior complaints, viewers concluded that race or ethnicity had influenced how quickly ordinary questions were interpreted as risk or noncompliance. The 3rd case lacked enough surviving material for a firm conclusion. Malcolm resigned before the board completed its disciplinary process. His resignation did not prevent the center from issuing its findings. The board barred him from future operational or governance roles at Langley, corrected the prior complaint files where the evidence allowed it, and sent written notices to the affected guests explaining what the review had established and what remained uncertain. Nora received a formal reprimand for allowing a staff witness to be isolated from the review she had helped preserve. She kept her job after accepting 6 months of external supervision over event operations. Elise did not attend the youth opening. Instead, she sent Jonah a letter and asked him not to answer immediately. There was no polished apology in it. She wrote that she had spent years believing generosity toward poor people proved she was not class-conscious, while privately measuring partners by whether they could move comfortably through her social world. Seeing Jonah in the donated coat had exposed a distinction she had never admitted to herself. She could support poverty at a distance and still fear being associated with it. She also refused to excuse his deception. Jonah appreciated that more than he expected. Good evening. They met at the diner where he had waited after being expelled from the gala. Elise ordered coffee and left it untouched. "I am sorry I denied knowing you," she said, "and I'm sorry I let people turn you into a threat because I was embarrassed." Jonah nodded. "I believe you. That doesn't mean you forgive me." "No." She looked almost relieved by the answer. He apologized, too, without attaching his test results to it. He admitted that he had taken a fear born from an old relationship, turned it into an experiment, and forced Elise to audition for information she did not know he was collecting. She had failed in a way that revealed something ugly. He had still created the stage. When they left, they did not leave together. Back at Langley, Jonah passed the entrance where the first guard had once blocked him before checking his invitation. A group of teenagers crowded through now, dripping rainwater and carrying instrument cases, backpacks, and grocery store umbrellas. No one examined their clothes before looking at the list. Tessa saw Jonah watching and handed him a printed copy of the finalized access policy. At the bottom was a note. 3 partner organizations had already requested permission to adopt it for their own public events. Jonah folded the page once and slipped it into the same inside pocket where he had carried Elise's invitation. This time, nobody asked him to prove he belonged there. Part 10, The Last Consequence and Open Havreason. 2 months later, Langley Arts Center mailed Jonah a copy of its final findings before publishing them. The letter did not describe him as a misunderstood donor or mention Price Meridian until the conflict disclosure section. It stated the simpler fact first. Jonah Price had arrived with a valid invitation, had been personally confirmed by his host, and had been removed after that host falsely denied recognizing him. Peter's suggestion that his identity might be fraudulent was unsupported by information available to staff at the time. The external review confirmed misconduct in 3 of the 4 historical files. Malcolm Dyer had used legitimate administrative privileges for an illegitimate purpose. Not to fabricate guests from nothing, but to make disputed removals appear better supported after they occurred. The board accepted his resignation, permanently excluded him from governance and event operations, and referred the findings to the 2 nonprofit boards where he still held advisory positions. Those organizations would make their own decisions. Langley did not pretend to control them. Nora completed her 6 months of external supervision and remained event director after the reviewer found no evidence that she had altered records herself. Her reprimand stayed in her personnel file because she had accepted Malcolm's framing too readily and had failed to protect Tessa when Tessa preserved the audit trail. Aaron was promoted to oversee guest access training across all public programs. Tessa moved into a newly created compliance coordinator role, a promotion she negotiated only after insisting the job include authority to challenge registration overrides rather than merely document them. Langley also published quarterly access metrics, credential disputes, removals after verification, reasons for overrides, and the number of complaints reopened after review. The first quarter showed fewer removals and more supervisor consultations before decisions were made. It was not proof that bias had vanished. It was something less glamorous and more useful, a system capable of revealing when practice drifted away from policy. The board restored the Alder Street Trust payment after the external firm certified that Jonah had not participated in personnel deliberations. The youth program completed its fall session without cancellations, and the rehearsal room renovation resumed 6 weeks later. Jonah renewed the trust's remaining commitment but refused the board's offer to name a studio after him. By then, business reporters had connected the trust to Price Meridian anyway. Articles described him as a black billionaire who had attended the gala dressed in donated clothes, a detail that threatened to turn the entire episode into a clever morality stunt. Jonah corrected that version whenever he could. He had not gone homeless because poverty was a costume that taught rich people wisdom. He had lied to someone he loved because an old betrayal had convinced him that certainty could be engineered. He had slept at New Hope Shelter because he wanted to know whether Elise's affection survived the disappearance of status. The experiment had exposed her class prejudice. It had also exposed his willingness to manipulate intimacy rather than risk asking a frightening question honestly. He and Elise did not reconcile. They met once more to exchange the few belongings left at each other's apartments, then stood beside her building entrance with nothing practical left to discuss. She told him she had begun working with a counselor and had withdrawn from 2 social committees where she had confused philanthropy with character. Jonah told her he had started therapy too. Neither offered those facts as proof of transformation. When she hugged him goodbye, he returned the embrace and let the relationship end without converting forgiveness into another test. The canvas coat went back to New Hope. Jonah washed it first, repaired a loose button badly enough that one of the shelter volunteers redid it while laughing at him, and placed it on the donation rack where he had found it. Then he stayed for dinner service. No photographer came. A man at the end of the counter complained that Jonah was stingy with mashed potatoes, and Jonah gave him another scoop. Later that evening, the older resident Jonah remembered from the cracked laptop found him near the vending machines. His name was Curtis Bell. He had finally gotten the maintenance job he had been applying for that night, but he handed Jonah a folder from the housing complex where he hoped to move. The application had been denied after an automated screening report listed an eviction that belonged to another Curtis Bell. Jonah looked at the paperwork, then at the shelter computer where Curtis had spent weeks learning to navigate forms, designed to reject mistakes faster than people could correct them. "Don't fix it for me," Curtis said. Jonah opened the folder. Outside, someone hung the repaired canvas coat back on the rack for the next person who actually needed it.